Fiorentina's amazing season ended with qualification for Europe, and to take us through that, here's Giancarlo Rinaldi.
Hello and welcome to Lega Football Podcast.
Okay, on the show today, we have a writer from Football Italia, also has his own podcast now, it's called Rigore. Giancarlo Rinaldi joins me. Giancarlo, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
An experienced Fiorentina expert, in my opinion. You've got to be happy with this season.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, after a number of disappointing seasons, this has actually been a season to smile about, and sneaked back into Europe on the final day as well. So that was the cherry on the cake, really. You know, the football was a lot brighter, and getting into Europe after a number of years away was, I think a lot of Fiorentina fans thought they might never get back into Europe the way they were playing. So yeah, no, it's been a positive season all round.
You wrote an article back in October, which I want to talk about, and you wrote about how Fiorentina evolved in the first few months in transition from the Iachini to Prandelli, back to Iachini era, then to Italiano. The previous 5 seasons were poor in your opinion, well, most people's opinion, let's be honest, and it went from Mai una gioia to c'è ancora speranza again, and now there is hope.
Under Iachini, you felt they still had good players, but they were just very predictable and very slow. It meant that no matter how good you were, the opposition were already in position and could cope with what you had to throw at them. Whereas under Italiano, suddenly there was a greater degree of urgency. There was definitely a higher demand on the players, but you know, he did make an immediate impact. There's no doubt that, you know, for Fiorentina fans, this was like sort of taking blinkers off and seeing the sun again, because they actually produced some football that was worth watching, and took a few scalps in the early rounds of the season, and you know that. So there was definitely a feeling that there was reason to be cheerful under Italiano, as opposed to the kind of more grim fare that we were used to under Iachini.
Getting Italiano in was the big win. He transformed the team from battling for draws, as you write about, to playing some of the most entertaining football in the division. The club record signing Nico Gonzalez, he showed promise early and was a consistent performer. And you wrote about the way he was able to reintegrate Duncan, Sotil and Amrabat. Perhaps this has something to do with Italiano's experience at Spezia, having to make do with what he's got and bring the best out of those players, as opposed to managers like Simone Inzaghi or Max Allegri, you know, your Juventus coaches who simply request big signings for big money.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I think that was the thing. Throughout the course of the season, I thought he was able to get a tune out of players that had previously looked like a disaster area, really. You know, I mean, Cristiano Biraghi as well at fullback was one that, you know, a lot of Fiorentina fans couldn't wait to see the back of him, and yet there he was. I mean, you'll remember there was a spell where every free kick he took ended up in the back of the net. It was absolutely astounding, and he took the sort of raw materials he had, and you know, there were some good. Obviously, the first half of the season he had Dusan Vlahovic, but there were others there that, you know, weren't so heralded, and yet he managed to kind of mould them into a strong unit, and players that we probably lost hope for suddenly started to look quite decent again. I would say, especially at the end of the season, Amrabat in particular, but yeah, right, Sotil as well was another one that Fiorentina fans couldn't stand. His end product was pretty terrible, and you know, it's still not perfect, but you know, he seemed to have a happy knack of picking the right player for the right occasion, and that's obviously, it didn't get it right all the time. There were some terrible setbacks, so you know, you have to give credit. A coach can do that, then I think he's definitely doing a good job, and I think that's the kind of coach that Fiorentina need, because you're probably not going to get, well, you're definitely not going to get the biggest names in the world, so you have to be doing something special, either with, you know, old stagers who maybe other clubs think they're past it, or new faces that are just carving out their kind of place in Serie A, and he's shown himself pretty consistently to be very good at that.
I think we both agree Italiano isn't afraid to mix things up. The stats show just 7 players appeared in more than 30 games this season, as opposed to 10 under Prandelli and Iachini. They struggled to get results. I did a lot of Spezia games 2 seasons ago in Italiano's first spell in Serie A, and the way he was able to harness some of the energy from these young players like your Agodelos or your Giazis. I think he's brought that over to Fiorentina, and he's been able to some of the powers from the likes of Sotil at times. Even Callejon has a second lease of life under Italiano as opposed to Iachini. You question whether Fiorentina would be able to sustain their beginning to the campaign. Conference League, they've qualified for that. They finished with 62 points. They defeated the old enemy Juventus in the final match of the season. That is another win. Obviously, there's room to improve, but they had three-game winning streaks this season. Huge improvement on the previous. They were all tough as well. The first one was against Torino, Atalanta and Genoa, all by scorelines of 2-1. They then defeated Sampdoria 3-1, Bologna away 3-2, and then Salernitana 4-0 in another three-game winning streak. The third was a win over Empoli in the derby. Then the win at the Maradona over Napoli 3-2, which I watched that game and I think it was possibly their best performance apart from the thrashing of Genoa. Then a hard-fought battle over Venezia. How did your cousin Marco find that one? Did you watch that? Did you watch that together?
No, we didn't watch it together. We don't live in the same town, but we traded insults over messages throughout the game. I think even Marco had to accept that I called it a 1-0 thrashing because Venezia barely got out of their half in that game.
It was a domination. Just to give some people context, Marco is Giancarlo's cousin. He's the world's biggest Venezia fan. He does the pod Rigore with Giancarlo. Going into the last round, Fiorentina sat in 7th position, equal on 59 points with Atalanta. Atalanta had a home game against Empoli coming up, and Fiorentina had to beat a team that's in the top 4. And it's also a team that you sold your best player to in January. You need to beat them after coming off a 4-1 loss against Sampdoria, and Atalanta just have to get over the line against Empoli. What were your thoughts going into that?
The only thing that gave me cause for optimism was having watched Juventus in the previous weeks. It looked a bit like the Bianconeri had started their summer holidays early as soon as they got that 4th place in the bag, which, was the bare minimum for Juventus to be achieving. And then they started to give space to younger players, and they definitely weren't playing with the same intensity. I mean, you remember it wasn't so long back in the season that they were still outside shots for the Scudetto because all the top teams kept slipping up and not getting the points. But as soon as they were kind of knocked out of contention, it was almost like that knocked the stuffing out of them, and they were quite flat. So that did give me some hope. Empoli, despite the heroics of their goalkeeper, you thought, well, eventually Atalanta will find a way through, and that news is going to filter through, and that's going to put even more pressure on Fiorentina against Juve. As a veteran watcher of Italian football, I knew that sometimes in the final games of the season you get results that surprise you, especially when a team that's still got something to fight for plays against a team that no longer has anything to fight for.
Precisely.
And so that was really what gave me some optimism against, because it was a curious game against Juve. It didn't quite have the poisonous edge that, to me anyway, it didn't feel like it had quite the poisonous edge that normally clashes with Juventus had. It was almost as if Juve were going through the motions, and once they did go behind, really their reaction to it was quite flat. And not to say that Fiorentina didn't deserve the win, and they did go for it, and they did have a lot of possession, but equally, that's happened before and they've lost games. But it was great, I think, to go out and get at least some recognition. It's achieve something with your season and get into Europe, and to do it against the team that you dislike the most was certainly a pleasant experience. And the Fiorentina fans were certainly delighted to put one over the old enemy. Get a European place back was quite a delight.
Fiorentina are back. Giancarlo Rinaldi, thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. You
can find Giancarlo at Jinkers on Twitter. You can also read more of what Giancarlo's writing at Football Italia. And for the full interview with Giancarlo Rinaldi regarding Fiorentina's season, that will be going live to all the Lega Football platforms.